There was a recent um, lecture, I guess, given. Now, the person who gave it is John Anderson, former um, Nationals Deputy Prime Minister. I think he was the Nationals leader. Yeah. So the lecture he gave was the Boyer lecture, I think. Boyer, I forget how to pronounce it. But what came out of this? This is interesting because, okay, I've got to stop scrolling too fast. He talks about this, or the tagline on it was talking about how the Western democratic world is at a civilizational moment. The tagline in when I was having a look, it said, it talks about the failure of globalization. That's not a new concept. It's been kicked around a little bit, certainly over the last couple of years. When the Trans-Pacific Partnership attempt failed, there was certainly a bit more media coverage or analysis or opinions appearing, suggesting that this idea of a globalization had run its course, because we were seeing TPP after TPP. Now, TPP was a rather bad idea for anybody who wasn't the US. It took a lot out of other nations, and it forced them into positions that weren't really good for them. And when it was rejected, people said, well, it's a return to nationalism. Which, now, nationalism, people will associate with certain political ideologies, but the idea of protecting a nation's industry capacity, productive capabilities, working population, etc. Yep, they're nationalist ideas, but you can't expect to partake in a global economy or a globalization system if you've got no money to do it with. You can't get the money if you don't have the development, if you don't have the productive capability. And, well, it's a race to the lowest, race to the bottom in terms of cheapest production. So production's going to shift to nations where workers are exploited, where there aren't the sort of employee protections, and people say, well, it helps lift standards of living. Well, it can do that, but at the same time, you've got places like, I forget the name for it, special economic zones, some of which have worked and done wonders. The original one in Ireland did, but no longer exists. There's plenty in China. Shenzhen is a big one. Now, it is special economic zones are places where the host nation, the nation where the place exists, reduces tariffs and taxes and regulation, basically. Within the zone, the idea is to attract foreign investment, industry to set up, and that they would then use the local population as employees, and that would then skill them. Now, in the case of the one in Ireland, it provided the kickstart to developing a more technical and capable workforce that had previously been either largely agrarian or low tech as such. I mean, Shenzhen, for example, very, very high tech, just across the border from Hong Kong. So it's in a position that, but you then look at, well, what's the standard of living? What sort of protections are there for workers in Shenzhen compared to the rest of China, for example? Or it opens the door for potential corruption, and the question is how much benefit now flows back into host nations from special economic zones. I mean, to begin with, it was great, but the proliferation of them now means it's a race to the bottom again. But anyway, the idea, he talks about a whole bunch of stuff, talks about needing to rediscover and rejuvenate the ideals and virtues that make them flourish, or improve them, or die off. And he's arguing that the Western democratic world now stands at one of these moments. The statement here that in 1945 or post-1945, it was an alliance of democracies that emerged from the horrors of World War II and the Holocaust, and it has become the liberal global order. Now, I find that an interesting statement, because when you look at the nations that, or the major allied powers that won World War II, came out on top, you could, well, depending on how you look at the nature of the US at the time, or the UK, of the three, only two could be regarded as democratic systems. Russia, which then became the USSR, I don't think anyone would have claimed that they were a liberal democracy in any way, shape, or form. And in fact, a lot of nations coming out of World War II, and that, I guess, post-World War II periods are going into the Korean War and into Vietnam. There was a lot of wars of liberation, a lot of decolonialization taking place. I'm sure if you ask the people in Bengal what they thought of UK politics at the end of World War II, they probably weren't that enamored with the idea of this Western liberal democracy. I mean, yeah, India gained independence, and then Pakistan, and then Bangladesh. You had a lot of colonial holdings through, well, Africa. Kenya gained independence not long after World War II, all the way through to, Rhodesia, Zimbabwe, Angola, Mozambique. You look at southern Africa here, Algeria, Tunisia. Well, Tunisia, I'm not sure if they were French, but Algeria in particular. Obviously, Indochina was eventually kicked out the French and then the US. Indonesia, the Dutch East Indies became Indonesia. They sought independence. East Timor, eventually, well, very, very briefly gained independence from Portugal before the Indonesians steamrolled them. And then even intervention in Korea. The idea that the South Korean government that was established before, during, and after the Korean War, I don't know that they're necessarily a liberal democracy. Same goes obviously for Indochina. There was a nominal democratic, Western democratic style government in South Vietnam, but the North Vietnam government certainly wasn't like that. And you had, I guess, a number of nations that embraced socialism or communism in some form. Cambodia certainly had Pol Pot come along, and in fact it was the Vietnamese that brought Pol Pot to heel the first time. You then also had a variety of movements through the Central and South America, and even if you argue that the intervention by Western forces and Western nations led to more democratic systems, I don't know that you'd argue that a lot of people who went through the School of the Americas, for example, ended up leading countries that could be classed as liberal democracies. If anything, there's probably only a very small handful of nations that you could call a liberal democracy, and contributing, therefore, to this liberal global order. I mean, even the UN Security Council, the 5 permanent members of it, they aren't all liberal democracies. I mean, even France would have been, particularly in post-World War II, would have been under de Gaulle. I don't know that you would have called it liberal at the time. So, is this a conceit we've told ourselves that, well, with the UN's come along with all these other bits and pieces, we've had this increased globalization and opening of trade? Well, it wasn't until Nixon basically engaged with China that China opened up for trade, more realistically. I mean, okay, we're in the first quarter of the 21st century here, but the various manufacturing bases in Asia, say through Japan and South Korea in particular, they didn't hit their straps for many years. I mean, they all went through a period where their exports or their technology was seen as a joke. And then eventually they develop their systems and capabilities to a point that they're no longer a joke, some more recent than others. Like, for example, if you look at a Hyundai car, for example. Now, Hyundai are a massive conglomerate, making ships and all the other bits and pieces and lots of stuff. But a Hyundai car, through the 90s, even to the early 2000s, they're regarded as rolling junk. But in more recent years, they've developed a lot more reliable cars, a lot better build quality. Their systems have really come up, and in part because they're part of massive mega conglomerates and things like that. It's like saying Samsung. You go back 30-odd years, and the idea of a Samsung phone would have been, well, about as realistic as an Apple phone. But the major companies like Nokia and Motorola and everybody else, well, they got swarmed by these other companies. But it's this idea that it was a liberal global order. I don't think so. I mean, even as those other nations change governments and things like that, I don't know that you'd necessarily say it's a liberal. They've become liberal democracies. I mean, you look at Indonesia, for example, post-independence. They went through a period of very somewhat violent internal struggles. They were very socialist aligned. I don't know necessarily you would have regarded them outright as communist, but certainly, I think it was Sukarno, was the president. But there was a period there where it was almost military-led and strongman type nation. Then over time, they've liberalised more to more democratic systems, but they've got their history behind them as well. It's like looking at, say, Malaysia after gaining independence from the UK as well. Whilst they have the external trappings of a democratic system, how they apply it over the last 20 or 30 years has been, well, in their own unique way, I guess. Now, they've certainly improved, but they went through periods where there was a lot of alleged corruption, and they certainly had the big teething stages as well. So the idea that the globe has this massive liberal global order, I don't know so much. Now, certainly the the reconstruction phases of Japan and Germany certainly did try and lead towards this democratic systems being introduced to replace the ones that had been in place before. But as I just said, a lot of the rest of the world was going through a period of decolonialization where they were fighting wars of independence in some places, or had engaged in more peaceful means of transferring power, but oftentimes it was at the point of a gun. So, yes, there was a lot of peace and prosperity, and yes, post-1945, the world has at large been more peaceful than it has been before. Yes, the subsequent fall of the Iron Curtain seemed to suggest that Western democratic systems were superior to planned economies and of the socialist systems. And there's how they were implemented. Okay, I mean, that seems okay on the surface. Market economies had sort of triumphed. Well, I mean, there are many reasons why the wall fell and things like that. Yes, you can't protect or prevent people from seeking better systems, I guess. That, well, it regarded itself as being not unique, the better ideological system. Okay. Then he goes on to say that democracy is in retreat. Well, okay. So you had the Arab Spring starting, when was it? 2000. Before 2012, I know that much. Sometime between 2009 and 2008 and 2012. But the idea was that we're going to, in essence, Lawrence of Arabia it up. Now, Lawrence of Arabia helped with that initial phase of Arabian independence, and, well, not just for Saudi Arabia, but certainly Arab independence through the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, the Middle East. It was certainly, at the time, politically and militarily expedient as a means to challenge and overthrow the Ottomans, draw their attention away from other places where the UK and associated forces were engaging, well, the Ottomans, the Turks, in conflict, and that breaking up the remnants of the empire certainly gave opportunity to, well, Western nations to move in and clean up the scraps. Drawback being how some of these nations then emerged was not done with respect to local populations that much, and effectively led to strongmen appearing. At the same time, the nature of the populations were still very much tribal in a lot of these locations and had different power structures. And the idea of just slotting a Western democracy in over the top didn't really match with how the local population lived or expected to have their voices heard. Now, the idea of giving people a voice and having them be active and get an active role in determining the government and type of government they have, great, good idea. But you need to understand that not everybody wants a Western-style democracy. Some people are quite happy with a monarchy or a tribal-based system, or one that's more socialist or whatever. Not everybody is going to want the same type of government. reality, really. So the idea of the Arab Spring as a means to overturn some of these governments that, well, some nations decided weren't free enough, worked to an extent, but also saw in some areas a worsening of local government infrastructure and support, and the emergence of, well, not necessarily the emergence, but allowing more violence to appear, I guess, more terrorism to appear. I mean, just look at, say, Syria as an example. I don't think many people would say that the Assad family were necessarily good in terms of how they expressed their power. And certainly there were people that suffered under their rule. At the same time, though, a lot of minorities within Syria received protection and were able to live openly and express their minority status and beliefs and things like that under a degree of protection. Following the civil war that dragged on for a lot longer than it probably should have, and the question about the appropriateness of the various groups that Western nations were supporting. It hasn't become a Western democracy. There's no, if anything, it's become even more of a strongman type setup. And the nature of the people who've secured power in Syria is such that a lot of those minority populations are now at real risk of being eradicated, because the people that gain power aren't very nice people at all. And so the question is, was it better off with Assad running the system, or these more extreme people running the system? And it's like also looking at Iraq as well. Whilst the Ba'ath Party and the tribe that Saddam Hussein belonged to, whilst they might have been a minority in terms of overall population within Iraq, and the way they expressed power was rather brutal and violent, it held a nation of very disparate populations and peoples together. And one of the things that was experienced once they got rid of the Ba'ath Party and Saddam was that the power vacuum was not smoothly taken up, or power wasn't smoothly taken up by any one group. It basically civil warred its way through things. So the idea that, we could have introduced these Western democracies by funding rebel groups and independence movements, it didn't work out in practice. It seemed to be an ideological misunderstanding, I guess. It looked like the sort of thing that somebody who had academic experience went, yep, no, this works in the paper, it's going to work in the real world. No, not quite like that. I mean, you could almost argue that the start of the conflict in Ukraine was linked to the tail end of the Arab Spring and those pushes to overturn governments and things like that, because Euromaidan was a replacement of the government in Ukraine at the time. And yep, the rest flowed out from that. The idea that global freedom is declining, political rights and civil liberties deteriorating, well, some of that is the West's fault. In fact, a lot of it is the West's fault, because they led to those nations being overthrown or throwing in their support behind nations or groups that probably should not have had support. So, like I was just saying there with Syria, whilst the situation before the Civil War wasn't necessarily great, it was light years better than what it is now. And the same goes for what happened in Iraq post 2003. Before 2003, yeah, it wasn't great. But what happened afterwards was much worse. And that goes to looking at, I guess, I'm sure that there are plenty of leaders around the world who look at things like that, particularly from smaller nations or places where there are very split ideological groups within the nation. And they're looking at it and going, I don't want that to happen to me. Therefore, we take steps. The other part too is, I guess, people feel more empowered to protest their viewpoints if their particular ideology didn't win a vote. I mean, it says here what election-related violence in 27 of the 66 nations, 2024. Now, we know that there was violence in Nepal, there was violence in Madagascar, there was violence in Peru, there was election violence in Cameroon? No. A North African nation, I think. And so they're just off the top of the head of the last few months. I mean, there's also protests even in the US now, and in Australia and the UK and France and Romania, and, well, the Dutch are going to the polls right now. Do you say that the protests, I mean, some of which went a little bit violent, I think there's some dark money at play, and there's some professional protest groups at play. It almost seems like that for nations where the political swing has been more to the right, been more conservative, there's been protests and there's been violence to a degree. It follows down the same line of people saying populism is bad. Well, the will of the people, I mean, that's the whole point of a democracy, is to provide a government that represents the will of the people, and that if the people don't like the way the government is, then they get replaced at the next election. But it became a thing that the term populism attracted a negative point of view because people saw it as a conservative thing. It got labelled as, well, these conservative popular movements, and, well, ideologically opposed people were complaining about it. And it's like, well, hang on. The whole point of the democracy is that it's the tyranny of the majority, effectively. And that the needle has swung. It'll swing back in the future. But it seemed that there was a lot of dummy spits going on. People were complaining because their particular ideology lost the election, and that they were unwilling to work with the people that had, or to accept that their viewpoint wasn't the dominant societal viewpoint. So, The Economist, okay, well, they're a little bit left-leaning, or a lot left-leaning, says that only 45% of people living in some form of democracy, 39% under authoritarian rule. It depends on how you define it, doesn't it? And so this idea of this liberal global order, so liberal globalisation, has come to an end. I just spent the first few minutes explaining. Don't know that it ever really existed outside a very, very narrow number of countries. That, yep, there are, say, for example, let's look at China. China had their civil war post post-World War II, even the KMT, the Chinese nationalists who ended up in Taiwan, I don't know that you would have necessarily described them as, liberal democratic. Almost a police state, really. In those early years, there was sometimes very little in practical terms to separate them from what was happening on mainland China. But even in mainland China, the communists went through several iterations of themselves and how they applied power and everything else. And the way you look at the Chinese government system now, it's centrally planned. Yes, it's it's almost a socialist democracy. I mean, well, no, hang on. Well, I'll wind that back. It's not a democracy in any. It's not even really a market economy because the special economic zones lead to it. But it's not quite communism either. Sure, it's the Chinese Communist Party that are in power and will always be in power. Well, not always, and have been in power for many years. It's not quite a communist system, though. It's sort of evolved somewhat in and taken on a number of capitalist tendencies. All right, but you wouldn't regard them as a social democracy or a liberal democracy. I mean, the idea of Hong Kong having greater freedoms post the handover from the UK, it seemed to work that way for a while. But the protests in the last few years seem to suggest that mainland China is expressing its will a lot more. And the suggestion to a number of people who are very liberalised that any conservative swing is seen as authoritarianism or a loss of this liberalisation. That's not true. It's the nations don't swing that far or that fast. There is a significant degree of momentum in economies and amongst nations. So, it's a problem of wealth transfer as well, and globalization certainly helped with that. It destroyed manufacturing industries within the nations that then outsourced that to cheaper nations, and so they became service economies, going back to the old primary, secondary, and tertiary industries. They outsourced their primary and secondary industries in order to become a tertiary economy, an economy based dominantly on services. But problem being, that just consolidated wealth at the business owner level, and the workers that had previously been factory workers and everything else either struggled to retrain and pick up equivalent work, or they were just out of work, full stop. And yeah, it did raise standard of living in some of the nations that picked up the manufacturing work. But with this idea of these special economic zones, sometimes those workers were, and are, horribly, horribly exploited. I mean, the garment industry in Bangladesh, I don't know anyone that would say that is healthy. But fast fashion and all that sort of stuff, you go to the shop, you have a look at where a lot of your clothing is manufactured, and it comes out of places like Bangladesh. And then you look at, or you see footage of their factories, and it's like, ooh, working conditions aren't great. Now, is it better than their previous standard of living? Possibly. But in terms of what the rest of the world would consider appropriate, maybe not. And then cost of living crises, and it's paying the bill forward. Well, but it's always been the idea, though, that even pension systems, they're not quite a Ponzi scheme, but they're not far removed. It's, other than very small periods of time in world history for various nations, there've always been systems that have relied upon future workforce and economic production in order to fund the active obligations of retirement for the class that had retired, if retirement is ever going to be a thing again in the future. And so, yeah, it's, I don't know that authoritarian systems are overtaking that in that regard. It's a lot of these complaints, a portion of these complaints seem to be along ideological lines, that people are looking at, say, Trump, for example, and saying that his stuff is anti-democratic and authoritarian. But we encountered that opinion piece, or the article a few weeks back, that in the midst of complaining about all of that, was forced to admit that, if anything, Trump is acting completely within the powers that are granted to him by the system. So whilst the way he's going about what he's doing might be confronting to some people, he's adhering to the legislative and procedural boundaries of his position very, very well. Just, there are people who don't like him doing it. And the idea that, yeah, we're breaking things down, I don't know. The idea here, okay, that Australia's always been relatively democratic, at least since Federation, 1901. There's been the emergence, I guess, of socialist elements within the governments, well, within political parties, but it's largely been relatively democratic. The main power base, even now, is a progressive Labor and very, very progressive lunatic Greens, and a conservative Liberal and National Party. The Nationals are always seen as more conservative than Liberals, but in general terms, that's it. Now, groups that in the past, like the Democrats or independents or small parties, tend to fit in around the spectrum as well, largely in the Senate, but give a bit of a balance to how power is expressed. Australia's direction is mostly the same, irrespective of who's in power. It's rare that you're going to find things go too far off the rails, but we'll see. I mean, we also had almost universal suffrage. We were pretty quick to it, particularly in like 1894. South Australia picked it up for the first time. 1902 to universal. However, whole sections of the Australian population were excluded such as Aboriginal Australians until, well, relatively recently. But Australia was doing quite well in terms of nations at the time, and a brand new nation, really, 1901. But we've retained it, mostly. But the problem there is, okay, we've got splits, we've got problems within how things are done. Now, it's almost a national pastime to not trust the government. Now, this is coming from somebody who was a politician for many years and at one point was Deputy Prime Minister. I don't know that this is necessarily a concern. I mean, it encapsulates that people don't trust their government that great. Well, that's healthy distrust of power. That's always been an Australian characteristic. I mean, at the same time, we've also got compulsory voting, and the idea that people are disengaging and are complacent, I don't know. He admits that, yes, our rejection of hierarchy, our easygoing irreverence, and our refusal to take ourselves too seriously, well, it sort of plays into that complacency and everything else. Yeah. It's... I don't really know. There is a difference, though. The whole... like national defence policy and things like that. Australia's Defence Force, ADF, we'll roll it back a little bit. We contributed huge numbers of troops and material to World War I and World War II, and have contributed to many conflicts over the years. But you look at the capabilities and numbers serving in Australia at the moment. Now, we've come out of a conflict, Afghanistan and, well, basically the Middle East. But even then, numbers of serving members weren't escalated to like Vietnam levels and things like that. Certainly post-Vietnam, there was a shift in, I guess, Australia's defence stand. It was wound down to a peacetime military and stayed that way for, well, through until the 90s. Then, even as Gulf War I kicked off, Somalia, Timor, they were the major conflict. I mean, we'd always contributed troops to the UN, but Somalia, Gulf War I, and Timor were the main, military deployments in the 90s. Even then, the enlistment numbers never really ramped up. I mean, they probably did, but not massive numbers. They were still cutting personnel numbers through the late 90s, early thousands. And then 2003, everything kicked off. But even then, I don't think that the enlistment numbers really rose that much. And when you looked at the number of vessels Australia had in its Navy, number of aircraft in the Air Force, and the number of troops and how they were distributed in the Army, there was a fairly reasonable question of how does Australia defend itself against a hostile belligerent? Were we to see a war on the level of World War II or an active invasion by another country? Well, for a start, which countries could do it? What is the purpose of how long could we expect to survive as a nation? And what is the military expectation? It's like, well, you're not going to survive for very long with a nation, with a military of the ADF size against a proper invading force. Best you can do is slow it down and delay. Now, the concept may have been that we wait, we invoke Anzucas. Hang on, is that right? Australia, New Zealand, no, ANZUS. Wasn't Anzucas. Anzucas is also there a bit as well. Invoke the ANZUS Treaty and get basically the US to come rolling to our defence. So in essence, it was the ADF would maintain a delaying strategy until more Allied forces could show up. Well, I mean, that kind of works. But the idea that given how other regional nations have jumped ahead in capability and spending and everything else, Australia, with only a population of 27.5 million and a fairly small military, even if we did spend 3% of GDP, it's not going to necessarily massively change our ability to carry on a deployable campaign. Certainly not at a level that we did in the past. I mean, we're talking Vietnam era. And so, yeah, there is a big change in the attitude, and the same goes. I don't think there's the public taste for it. The public's got the stomach for it, really. And certainly, yeah, compared to World War I and World War II, and a little bit of Vietnam, there just isn't the support now. Yeah, Vietnam obviously had not necessarily great public support, but the experience of the Nashos, the National Servicemen, that probably helped colour the longer-term public desire to maintain an expeditionary military. Now, we still have expeditionary capabilities, but it certainly became more of a defence force, as in a military to defend national interests within Australia's borders and super adjacent. And, well, yeah, the military training and stuff, we not armed anywhere to the level that we used to, and that's fine. I mean, there just isn't the personnel in the forces to do it, and they certainly wound back. There was like I just said, there were the cutbacks into peacetime, and I don't know that if there was an effort to really ramp the numbers up, it could be done. It just seems that there is no stomach for it. Now, the idea here that he says that we have no minesweeping protection in terms of ports. I mean, you're looking at mining being used in the Black Sea at the moment with the Ukrainian conflict. In order to get mines into Australian ports, well, you need the belligerent to reach all the way out here and do it, which gives Australia the opportunity to stop it. Yes, loss of mine hunting, okay, that's a problem, but the question is it a capability that is realistically going to be used against us in the future, or potentially going to be used? Now, the fact there's no BMD, I don't know. Again, you look at the size of the country and what you'd need to protect major population centers and stuff like that. Now, South Korea, for example, they've got deployed surface-to-air missiles and ABM, anti-ballistic missile systems, BMT systems, throughout South Korea, and they're pretty well overlapped, and I mean, it's defence in depth. But if you're going to do that here in Australia, well, one, it's prohibitively expensive, and two, I don't know that you're necessarily going to get systems rolled out for Australian defence. Again, you don't necessarily have the numbers of personnel to run them and to keep it running. Let's assuming that you go for, say, a Patriot Pack 3 or something like that. Great, it'll integrate into the US system when the US comes along to help with our defence. But how many of them do you need in order to protect the major population centres? And what sort of reach do they have? How far are you expected to defend? I mean, even nations that are actively engaged in this sort of stuff find it difficult to intercept anything really above SRBM type stuff. If someone wants to reach Australia, it'd have to be a larger IRBM up into ICBM type class. And, well, there's debate about whether the Patriot, like a Patriot Pack 3, can effectively defend against a target like that. Yeah, I mean, it's one thing to say we need BMD protection, but the reality should be considered, are we even in a position where that is a real threat? Yeah. Reserves, 3 weeks. Yeah, look, see, that's assuming this is Australia is going to fight and survive by itself. Yeah, no, I don't agree with these statements from him. Yep, housing crises and stuff. So he suddenly moved on from the end of this global democratic globalisation system, and it's now talking about other issues within society, housing, etc. Gotta say, I find, I mean, this is obviously an older suburb that has been rebuilt. I mean, there's a house that's probably original, probably one back there as well. A lot of these have been rebuilt or extended. You look at the amount of space. They've got a backyard pool, good for them. But they've built right up to the property boundary. It looks like the carport side. And effectively right up to the property boundary on both sides, the overhang. And it's like, well, where's the space? This house as well has touching the property boundary on both sides. Same back here. There's very little space between. And even then, okay, they've got outdoor living space, but they've given up outdoor space, yard space, for having a bigger place under roof. I don't know that trade-off's always good. Go up maybe, but even then there's problems going up, and that's an older style 2-story place. But I mean, that there's been subdivided. There at least 2 sets of apartments, 2 sets of units, another older style. You get this mishmash of styles, and it doesn't do anything. I mean, these is still low density. Maybe trending medium density, but still low density living as far as everything's considered. Yeah. And yep, home ownership becoming more out of reach of everyday Aussies. It's, yeah. We've looked at articles where they talked about you had this period, mid 20th century, where migrants, refugees coming out of Europe, in particular, to Australia were coming into a system where they weren't necessarily at a disadvantage compared to Australians already living in Australia. Everybody had pretty good chance at high-paying work, or relatively high-paying work, and the ability to own their own house and take holidays and, live the lucky life, live the good life, as far as Australia's concerned. But that's then turned and burned and become a problem. And, global financial crisis and the COVID pandemic causing issues. Well, it is. And the idea, okay, he's saying that the government in France is collapsing because it can't manage its financial affairs. Okay, they can't pass a budget, but it's collapsing because they've forced a coalition of parties that are ideologically, opposed to Marine Le Pen, but they're almost as much ideologically opposed to each other. Yeah, okay, and the net effect is they can't pass a budget. But it's collapsing because it's ideologically based, ideological splits. Germany can no longer afford its welfare state. Well, there's a few reasons for that. But, there certainly was, the COVID pandemic certainly kicked a lot of nations in the backside and caused, reactions in a way that might take a fair bit of time to be felt still. I mean, a lot of pain is still coming down track, and it did increase the amount of distrust and complacency, and that it certainly was a period where the principles of civil liberty were quite readily stomped upon by government and were very easily discarded. And that, this statement here, that we seem to forget that a vital task of democratic government is in fact to restrain its own powers. Yeah, but to criticise that, your voice was suppressed. And so criticism and censorship and, it's not great. Now, I mean, Australia's doing reasonably well, I've got to say. It's not all doom and gloom. There's been things in the past that weren't great, blackbirding, the status of Indigenous Australians post-Federation up until the 1960s. There's plenty in Australian history that isn't great to look at. But are we in a good position going forward? Well, I think pretty good. But the funny thing is, after he's talked about the collapse of this global order, he spends the rest of his presentation talking about the focus on national issues, nationalism, nationalist issues. No, we've got issues obviously going forward. There are valid issues for people to protest against. There's not a reckoning. There's still things that have to fall out of what took place in and around COVID, for example. Certainly the powers that governments are trying to take for themselves. I mean, even the whole idea of the under 16 social media ban, for example. That's one of those sort of things where you look at it and it's like, well, is that a suppression of civil liberties, or is it a step too far by government? This is the falling of a democratic system because it was being introduced by people that weren't elected into positions. So it's interesting.